Hello, everyone. We have finally arrived at part 4, week 10. In part 4, we will cover a few important topics in the practice of pastoral care. There are loss and coping, domestic and sexual violence, and chaplaincy. So after looking into these topics, the course will be completed by discussing spirit enlivening care in our community. So we're almost getting there at the end of the course. As the first topic of part 4, application of pastoral care, we will look into loss and coping, or in other terms, loss and restoration today. So let me just share the screen here. Let's see. So, and by the way, hopefully all of you kind of enjoyed the absence of lectures for the last few weeks. But just to give you a heads up, this lecture will be a lengthy lecture because loss and coping is such an important subject in pastoral care because, you know, whether you're pastors, or whether you're social workers, whether you are a chaplain, you will encounter these people who are suffering from these significant losses. So before we move on to the practice of loss and coping, I want to emphasize that this lecture is, I mean, I was wishing that we would have more time to actually cover this over, a few weeks, but unfortunately that's not the case. So we will have to cover this subject only today, this week. So bear with me, even if it's kind of like too long and you're busy, tired. Good thing is next week is a short week, and the spring recess is coming up, so there will be no discussion forum next week. You will have some time actually to, take a breath and take a break a little bit. So before we move on to the actual lecture, I wanted to share, because it's a lengthy lecture, I wanted to share just short excerpt. Robert Niemeyer is one of the really prominent scholars in grief theories, especially in psychology. So let's go ahead and read it. Like a novel that loses a central character in the middle chapters, the life story disrupted by loss must be reorganized and rewritten to find a new strand of continuity that bridges the past with the future in an intelligible fashion. When people lose someone they love or someone who took a pretty important part of their lives, it's like a story where a central character is gone in the middle of the story. Then what happens? Because of the loss of the main character, the story from that point forward needs to be reconstructed to properly bridge the past stories with the future stories, and the storyline should make sense by making proper meanings of the past, current, and future stories. It is very hard and could be even chaotic to go through that transition, and pastoral caregivers will be there companioning with the care seeker through that transition. So it is significant for us to understand what loss and grief means primarily from intercultural psychological perspectives of grief. So to learn these theories and things that we need for our grief care, here is the outline for today's lecture. Since our course is asynchronous course, there is a great limitation of in-person interactions and discussions, as you know. That's why we have been doing the discussion forum weekly and replies, all that. And I really appreciate your participation and proactiveness. But this application part of the course will be the part where we really wish that the course was synchronous so that we could talk more dynamically about these important and dynamic subjects and share each other's understanding, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case for us. And an asynchronous course also has its own strength. But, since we're not limited to the different time zones and locations, more people have opportunity to actually access these materials and learn from it. So we're trying to overcome the lack of in-person interaction by focusing on readings and lectures and online discussions. This week's lecture will be lengthy, as I mentioned, because it's such an important subject. So, thinking of those limitations from asynchronous course, the nature of the asynchronous course, we kind of like gotta try hard to make up that lack of in-person interactions, right? So please read the reading assignments as much as you can. Carrie Doehring's chapter is really important, really helpful, and all other ones are significant really in its own way. So anyways, moving on. Oh yeah, before we move on, we're gonna go through like loss and grief, like what do they mean? Like what are the definitions? And then the basics of loss and grief, like what are the types of loss and what are the grief that we don't usually recognize, and what and then what's the grief counseling? Well, I don't think I actually included that. I think I put it all the way down to the end of the lecture, if any. So loss and cope is two-folded, right? One is loss. Loss happens, and people have to kind of process what this means. And then after that, they have to learn how to cope with it in a healthy way. And in that process, the pastoral care is a helper for them to kind of develop the proper coping skill to the loss so that they can have the holistic restoration. So the second part is coping and restoration. So we will see 5 important scholars and their own models in the grief theory field. And then from then on, we're going to think about like, what does it mean when it comes to pastoral care and practice of care for the bereaved. And then we will share some helpful tools that you can use. So first of all, before we begin, we need to think about like what's our basic approach to loss, which is intercultural pastoral care. I don't know if you all remember, but I mentioned in week 1 and 2 lectures that pastoral care needs to be approached from 3 different levels, which are macro level, meso level, and micro level. When we look at loss from these 3, these questions will arise. From a macro level, how does one's culture understand, name, and respond to death and loss? And then secondly, from the meso level, how does one's family, religious, and communal tradition understand, name, and respond to death and loss? So the macro level is the culture, the larger society and the culture. And the meso level is family, community, and religions. And micro level is me, myself. So how does one themselves understand, name, and respond to death and loss? So these 3 questions will be a great guide when you first hear that there is a care seeker who just had a significant loss and you're brainstorming about your care plan. By asking these questions, you will not be stuck in a monocultural pastoral care approach. So there are terms, and it may be confusing sometimes, but I mean, most of the reasons is that there's no one universal definition of each term agreed by all these different scholars and grief theories and models. So I'm just gonna introduce you to basic understandings of these terms. And oftentimes, I mean, knowing the differences between the terms is important, but it's not really essential for you to practice the grief care. So loss is derived from events such as death, and divorce, and any other types that were there in one's life but not there anymore. Doehring categorizes the types of loss very well, which we will look into in the next slide. Grief. As we read from Worden's chapter, Worden defines that when loss happens, a natural response to the loss, grief is generated, and grief can be understood as an emotional release. The American Psychological Association defines grief as the anguish experienced after significant loss, and it often includes physiological distress, separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, obsessive dwelling on the past, and apprehension about the future. Intense grief can become life-threatening through disruption of the immune system, self-neglect, and suicidal thoughts, unquote. This definition of grief is pretty similar to Melissa Kelley's understanding of grief. Mourning, however, is understood in various manners. Worden, for example, differentiates mourning from grief, explaining that mourning is a process one goes through adapting to the death of the person or whatever the cause of the loss. Melissa Kelley, however, who is the pastoral theologian, however, understands it as a psychoanalytic term for grieving, which is, quote, societal expression of post-bereavement behavior, unquote. Doehring emphasizes that in order for mourning to be liberative, people and communities need dynamic ways to express their grief, utilizing various methods, including personal, family, and community rituals. Bereavement, lastly, is the loss to which the person is trying to adapt and the experience of having lost someone close. Kelley defines it as a state of deprivation or loss without presumption of any response. So you can be bereaved without experiencing grief. If the loss is not really significant, you may not even go through the grief. Bereavement is often interchangeably used with loss by scholars and psychologists, however. So now we're going into the types of loss. I mean, all of these, the types and the explanation of this is all in Doehring's book, but I can't really like skip this. It's really important in order to make the lecture. So we'll briefly look into this. In their classical text, all our losses, all our griefs, Mitchell and Anderson suggest that losses can be understood as generally of 6 principal types, which Doehring in chapter 6 primarily uses. Since this categorization is theoretical distinctions, a single experience may encompass one or more of these types. So, you know, the loss may involve material and relational. The loss may be categorized as relational, intrapsychic, and functional. You know, all these things may encompass with each other. The types are all these here. The first type is material loss. Material loss is the loss of extrinsic and tangible things that you can actually touch, such as losing a family home that you're emotionally attached to, or you're born and raised there, and like the house, because of the debt, the house is not yours anymore, or the house is too old to sustain, so you can't really maintain it. So that's material loss. Relational loss is loss of a relationship, such as divorce, death, even a ruptured friendship. Even relational loss is one of the most primary types of loss when we talk about loss and grief. Intrapsychic loss is somewhat tricky to understand, since it's the loss of something that cannot be visible. So it's the loss of some things, persons, or it can be places even, that have sacred values. So for example, giving up a dream can be the intrapsychic loss. You have been dreaming to be, let's say, a pilot, and then due to some problems, you had to let go of the dream. Or a blow to one's self-image, or even losing future with an unborn baby by miscarriage, can be examples of intrapsychic losses. Functional loss describes the loss of bodily use or functioning, such as loss of speech following a stroke, gradual loss of hearing as part of the aging process, or any body functional loss caused by disability, illness, aging, or any types of causation. It can be visible and invisible, and even like a traumatic brain injury, TBI, or autoimmune diseases are examples of the invisible functional losses as well. Role loss describes the loss of a familiar function or role, such as that of family breadwinner for 30 years who lost his or her job, or the loss of feeling like a parent after the death of child. Like for example, easy example would be like someone who who had been in the executive position for like 30 years, and he retires from the position. Like that's raw loss, because he loses many different aspects of the values and meanings that was significant for them. System loss describes the loss that an entire system or group experiences, such as a neighborhood experiences when a family moves from the familiar area to the strange one. The experiences of an office staff when someone is fired, or marriage of a daughter, which generates a new formation of family systems. So all these things can be systemic loss. There are griefs that relatively are not recognized enough. First grief is disenfranchised grief, and it is the grief that cannot be openly expressed or publicly or socio-culturally validated. When your grieving doesn't fit in with your larger society's or community's attitude or beliefs about how one grieves, what one has lost, such as miscarriage, or how the loss happened, such as suicide, or the types of relationship that was lost, such as same-sex relationship in a conservative community or family. Any grief that is not socioculturally invalidated, that is socioculturally valid, well, that is not socioculturally validated and suppressed, can be considered as disenfranchised griefs. When someone goes through this disenfranchised grief, it'll be really more complicated and mixed feelings with guilt and all kinds of like different negative emotions will happen. Chronic sorrow is an interesting concept. This refers to a grief response to a non-death related loss that permanently changes one's life, unquote. This type of grief was first introduced by Simon, let me try it, Olshansky. So Olshansky, just in case you want to look him up. Simon Olshansky in the 60s to identify the distressed parent with a disabled child experience. And then the concept was popularized by an American psychotherapist, Susan Ruth. Also referred to as a living loss. So they sometimes call it chronic sorrow or living loss. These days, chronic sorrow is used more widely compared to its original definition. For chronic grief, when the grieving person constantly has to readjust to the life with loss that she or he faces day by day. For example, when there is a neurodegenerative disease or chronic illness occurs, the long-term caregiver to the person who has the disease, or even the patients themselves, may have chronic sorrow as they repetitively try to readjust their life. Oftentimes, chronic sorrow and disenfranchised grief overlaps because some people, some community or society may not even recognize it as a loss. Other than these two, there is also ambiguous loss, which refers to uncertain loss, such as loss by crime that the body was not found. Grief born of injustice has significant socio-ethical political implications as the grief did not and should not have happened, but was created by systemic evil or unjust socio-cultural systems or reality. Last week, this photo here, gosh, this is really overwhelmingly heartbreaking picture. A photo of a 10-year-old boy in Gaza, whose name is Yazan Kafarne, shocked the world. The photo was taken in February with his family's permission as he struggled for his life. He has had the underlying disease, but the famine definitely played a huge part with it. By March 4th, Yazan was dead. Sexism, racism, ableism, classism, heterosexism, linguicism, that is the language-based discrimination. And then discrimination against migrants and immigrants. Executed discriminations can generate grief born of injustice. As you can all see, all these things can be considered as grief born of injustice. I mean, these days looking at the current world politics and the wars everywhere, and the discriminations and violence, it's almost overwhelming for us to take in. And it causes a lot of grief born of injustice in us. So it would be good to name this to kind of conceptualize what we are going through as well. And also you can utilize this in your pastoral care settings. So Paul Rosenblatt, one of the reading materials for this week, in that short article, powerfully illustrates how much differences cultural notions of death and loss can create in one's process of mourning. Different cultures may present grief as muted or excessive by US standards. These cultural and intersectional components need to be considered when a pastoral caregiver encounters someone who is struggling with recent significant loss. So try to read his article if you have time. Yeah, I mean, let's see. So as you can see, like these intersections of different social and cultural political components can take a place and play a part in the complexities of grieving process. So how can we see these different types of grief and loss interculturally? That's really important guiding question that can anchor your focus of pastoral care for grief and to understand more integratively of someone's situation. What is it that challenges your perspective as you encounter your care seeker who are going through disenfranchised grief? If there is, I mean, there will be anyways, like all kinds of differences in terms of your where you're coming from and your cultural background and all these things. So in order to reduce that gap of understanding, and understanding the differences between my notion of grief and his or her notion of grief, we need to constantly challenge ourselves and our perspectives on grief and loss and what the other person may go through right now, because it may be very different. What is the intercultural meaning of the grief that your care seeker is going through? So these questions will be really anchoring your perspectives in an intercultural format. Okay. All right. When loss happens and one grieves, the goal of the grieving process is to come to the restoration of oneself as the one processes various emotional struggles, emotional release, and reconstructs the meaning of the loss and life, right? So assessing the situation is one thing. Another thing is like assessing the coping and restoration. Like how are we gonna do this? How can I help this care seeker to come to the restoration and recovery in various ways? Where do we start to discuss that, to think about it? What are the theoretical grounds that we need to know as pastoral caregiver in order to help the care seeker to grieve properly? So this question we need to assess one's way of coping with the loss first, right? So how is the care seeker coping with loss and grief? How are they utilizing their religious spiritual traditions to cope with loss and grief? Or is it helpful? It's not helpful. If it's not helpful, then they need to reconstruct their meanings and beliefs and reinterpret the tradition, right? So how would you characterize their spiritual orienting system? Is the loss generating spiritual struggles? How is the loss impacting the care seeker's meaning making? Do they have routines, spiritual practices that give them a sense of peace, calmness, hope, and or connection? Are they connected to a life-giving or supportive community? Have any coping mechanisms become spiritually or emotionally problematic? To answer these questions, there are models that we first need to learn. And there are many models, right? Because it's such an important subject in psychological and religious field and philosophical field as well. But mostly it's approached by the psychologists. And there are, I would say, of course I can add more, but I would say 5 distinctive models are there that we can actually get help from. So stage model is first, and then 4-phased model, task model, which was one of the reading assignments, companioning model, I really love the idea of it, narrative and constructivist model. So we're gonna go through it briefly. I mean, of course, it's impossible to do it in depth. Well, it is possible if you give me like a few days, right? But we'll just go through it briefly, each of these. So stage model. The most popular model that has been used in the field, and it was developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a Swiss-American psychiatrist, and she is considered to be a pioneer in near-death studies because she was studying the hospice patients. And author of the internationally best-selling book On Death and Dying, where she first discussed her theory of the 5 stages of grief, also known as Kubler-Ross model. Kubler-Ross and her collaborators developed their ideas qualitatively. Well, I mean, it depends on mostly it was considered to be qualitatively because it doesn't really involve too many people, depending on like how you define too many. But they conducted this in-depth interviews with over 200 terminally ill patients. And over the years, after her 5-stage model, the experts added 2 more stages to this 5-stage. And now 7 stages model is really commonly used. Kubler-Ross's 5-stage model is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally comes to acceptance. The 7-stage model, however, it involves shock and denial, pain and guilt, anger and bargaining, depression, reflection, loneliness, the upward turn, reconstruction and working through, acceptance and hope. So we're looking to the 7-stage model, since Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief are integrated into this 7-stage model. The first, shock and denial. After, this is a state of the disbelief and denial and numbed feelings due to the shock after a significant loss. The bereaved person may have a difficult time accepting the reality and try to deny the reality or the gravity of the loss. This stage may last, I don't know, a few days to 4 weeks even longer it may be, but hopefully that's not the case. The second stage is pain and guilt. After facing the harsh reality, the person now deals with the excruciating pain, which needs to be fully experienced without trying to force themselves to reduce the pain or to avoid the pain. Because if you avoid the pain doesn't just go away and you can't really progress in the mourning process. The third stage, anger and bargaining. At this stage, the person may feel anger and try to negotiate within oneself or God or, in a higher being in an attempt to change the loss that has happened. So it's really, it's full of like emotional turmoils. And then fourth stage depression, a period of isolation and loneliness comes in. And during this time, they primarily process and reflect on the loss. Fifth, the upward turn. Now the person has gone through all those roller coaster of emotions and reflected on the loss and its meanings. The person's grieving process turns upward, not downward, showing more calmness. Sixth step is reconstruction and working through. Now the person is more functional because the person is calm. Now she's more functional. The person may be able to put things together to get back, on their feet. The person feels that life without the significant person may be workable with realistic solutions. And then finally, the seventh, acceptance and hope. Finally, the gradual acceptance of the new reality without the significant other or without whatever they had that they lost, and the acceptance of the life takes over the agonies and depressions, and the person is more future oriented now and practice constructive coping skills to live their lives after the loss. Going through these difficult stages of grief, the pastoral caregiver can be aware of the distinctions between normal grief and clinical depression. One thing that I really want to remind you is that, of course, all of you by now should know, we are pastoral caregivers, not clinicians or trained psychotherapists, right? So we really need to be aware of our limitations as pastoral caregivers. But knowing the differences is always very helpful and gives you some idea of like what to do next, right? So normal grief is like, of course, responds to comfort and support, often openly angry, relates feelings to loss, can experience moments of enjoyment, exhibits feelings of sadness and emptiness, may have transient physical complaints, expresses guilt over some aspects of loss, has temporary impact on self-esteem. But clinically pathological depression may often does not accept support, irritable but does not directly express anger, does not relate feelings to particular life event, in this case it's loss, exhibits pervading sense of doom, projects sense of hopelessness and chronic emptiness, has chronic physical complaints. So it's compared to this, like this is normal process is transient physical complaints, but this is like chronic physical complaints. And then has generalized feelings of guilt, presents a deep loss of self-esteem. Of course, you probably know that the sense of guilt is such an overwhelming emotion when you have clinical depression. So knowing these differences will kind of give you an idea and gives you the signs of, okay, like I need to be alert about this person. I may need to provide some proactive intervention for this person by utilizing this person's, I don't know, family members or the communal resources, all that. So there, even though the stage model is the most commonly used model in the grief theory and care, there are criticisms of this. Mostly the primary criticism comes from the concept of stage. The concept of stages can be misunderstood and applied too rigidly and linearly by the caregivers and practitioners, which had happened before, even though Kubler-Ross and her colleagues emphasized that no, it shouldn't be that way, but it has been practiced. There has been a tendency that the clinicians or people who are caregivers tend to use this model as like rigid stages, like one after another, to get to that goal of the final stage. Not all grief process is linear, and the process usually may go back and forth between different stages, as well as presenting diverse emotions at the same time. If it's, for example, still shock still may be there, while also at the same time the person is going through the pain and guilt and depression at the same time, right? So this doesn't have to happen like in a linear process. Even though Kubler-Ross and her colleagues have pointed this out over and over again, emphasizing the stages, the fluidity of stage, flexibilities of the stage, it still, there were some people who have used this strictly and even forced the bereaved to move on to the next stage, which is really not good, because there may be some lack of time or process passing through or skipping for this person to properly cope with the loss. This is where another criticism comes from. The stage model should not be understood and used prescriptively as opposed to descriptively. So we got to understand this model as a description of commonly shown symptoms of people who are going through loss. For example, it's not that the person must move through each stage linearly to reach the final stage. Individuals react differently, and there may be an absence of certain stages at some point or in different orders, right? So it's not that like they have to go through each stage. It's more of the descriptions of common symptoms that they're describing here. Next, the stage model of Kubler-Ross was actually helping John Bowlby and Murray Parks to develop four-phased grief model. So we'll go through it really briefly. Shock and numbness. In this first phase, the term denial is replaced, as you can see, with disbelief because of the negative connotation the denial gives. So with disbelief and numbness, shock and numbness, rather than using denial. This phase is pretty similar to the first stage of the 7-stage model. The person becomes unresponsive or numb to the new situation after the loss. The second phase is searching and yearning. This phase can be understood as the counterpart with the anger and bargaining stage in the 7-stage model or 5-stage model. The person will attempt to bargain with oneself or the higher being to undo the loss and try to investigate the reason for the loss and suffering. The third one is disorganization and despair. Depression stage will be the closest stage for this phase. The person experiences full acceptance of the new reality. Therefore, they may present some signs of depression. Finally, reorganization and recovery. This phase can be understood as the last two stages of the 7-stage model. The person experiences a renewed sense of identity. It's not my word. As they overcome the sense of loss and begin to feel in control of new life after the loss. The principal difference of this phase model from the stage model is to understand the mourning process not as linear and prescriptive, but as dynamically oscillating between different phases. So as you can see, it's not really linear. Once you have the loss and you get into the phase 1, from then on, you may oscillate between these phases, different phases. And then finally, you come to the recovery process. But still, even in the recovery process, you are still dealing with these phases, right? So it's very dynamic. So you can read it later. Test model. It's developed by William Worden. Since our reading assignment covers this part, I'll briefly mention and move on. And mostly, you will probably be able to understand based on what we discussed about the stage and phase model. Task model is composed of 4 basic tasks in adapting to loss, which is first, accepting the reality of the loss. Second, the process, the pain of grief. And 3, adjust to a world without the deceased or external, internal, or spiritual, right? Whatever the kind of losses they have. To find a way of remembering the deceased or lost while journeying through the remainder of one's life. So these are the task model. Ellen Wolfeld's companioning model. This is an interesting model. Wolfeld's companioning approach to grieving understands grief as a natural extension of the ability to give and receive love. Thus, grief should not be avoided and should be fully experienced. The caregiver or emotional supporter serves as a companion by the bereaved as they walk through the grieving journey. So it's not really like Western concept of like stages and phases and all that. It's more of like journey, one's life story journey that that you cannot really avoid. If once you're born, this kind of things will happen. Wohlfeld says, quote, companioning is about going to the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It is not about thinking you are responsible for finding the way out. If you're interested in this model, you can read his book, Companioning the Bereaved. Okay, let's move on. Whew. Long lecture. Wohlfeld's, oh no, I did that. Okay, so Niemeyer. So final model of the grief, we're almost there, is narrative and constructivist model by Robert Niemeyer. Niemeyer is one of the really popular theorists, psychologists in the field. This model is based on the meaning-making process of grieving. He is basically arguing that people construct their new reality after loss through a narrative of their own life stories, which are constructed and influenced by their own belief systems and worldviews. Through the mourning process, the bereaved person reconstructs meaning in life and the loss. Reconstructing one's identity after the loss is also a significant process. In this meaning finding and meaning reconstructing process, they validate or invalidate the framework and beliefs in their life and find a way to incorporate the loss into their new identity or new life stories by finding meaning of their loss and the changes after the loss. Emotions in this process can be really utilized in a good way as a guide as they try to reconstruct the meaning of life and loss and reconstruct the sense of self. Remember the quote that I used at the very beginning of this lecture? That was his book, his writing. And like, like losing the main character in the middle of the story, like gives you some idea of like how hard it can be and how necessary it is to reconstruct the meaning and the stories after the loss. Caregivers can use this model by helping the bereaved to retell the story of their loss. So you can help them to retell the loss and what it means, what this person meant to them. By using the past tense, you can actually help them to accept the reality, to actually see the reality. You can also let them write a goodbye letter or explore feelings through metaphors or even drawing or using art, using religious symbols is also helpful. So you can utilize all these different things if you want to use his model. So finally, in pastoral care, the caregiver can utilize these questions as they assess the stories of the loss and meaning and the severity of the situation. How are they utilizing the bereaved religious, spiritual tradition to cope with loss and grief? How would you characterize their spiritual orienting system? Is the loss generating spiritual struggles? How is the loss impacting the care seekers' meaning making? Do they have routines, spiritual practices that give them a sense of peace, hope, or connection, supportive community? Have any coping mechanisms become spiritually or emotionally problematic? I read this earlier in this lecture, and now we are kind of reminding ourselves that by asking these questions to yourself, even about this person, the bereaved, it'll be helpful for you to kind of think holistically. So using Robert Niemeyer's narrative and constructivist model, Melissa Kelley, she is a pastoral theologian, and her work is most primarily focuses on grief. And she develops her pastoral theology, based on Niemeyer's constructivist theory. And she points out, we actually read her chapter, one of her chapters, chapter 4. She points out about the importance of meaninglessness, because meaninglessness can be dangerous at times, since meaninglessness, quote, means the absence of all those things we have identified with meaning. The lack of deep sense to the world or to one's life can be detrimental. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. These are not my word, it's somebody else's on her. She uses this quote, but I think it's really helpful for us to actually see how important it is to find and to help the care seeker to find the meaning of life and of the loss and of the experiences, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and socially. So it is important to secure the space for the bereaved to question and process the meanings of loss and life freely, so that nothing will be in the way as the bereaved mourns and searches for the meaning. Especially on the conservative side or very like doctrinated denominations, tend to put some taboos that like, how there can you question God, right? All those like different taboos in the religious practice can be very, very harmful. So you gotta watch out and see if there's anything that's in the way for this person to recover and reconstruct the meaning. When you see any signs that may be dangerous, as a pastor, as a chaplain, as a social worker, as a nonprofit organization volunteer, you can begin by asking about hopelessness and or thoughts of death and dying or sense of depression as you empathize with the bereaved. For example, saying, it must be very hard as you go through tremendous amounts of pain. Because of the pain, sometimes people find themselves having thoughts of giving up on life. Have you ever been having any thoughts like this? By checking on them. If the person implies any of the thoughts, you can move forward and check by asking, have you ever thought about how you might go about this? Since thinking of suicide and concretizing the plans of the thought are very different things. If the person has thought about how to execute the thought, you will need to carefully refer the person to a professional therapist or clinician. Knowing your limitations as a pastoral caregiver, again, is very important. So either you refer this person to a proper person, or this person is socioeconomically struggling. You may have to research and find some public resources that may be available. A lot of clinicians and psychologists try to come up with an index to evaluate and assess the risks of the bereavement. When a significant loss happens, and you may want to check on these factors to see if the person is at high risk during bereavement. If several of these factors are present, they may need extra support or intervention, or you may want to take extra care of them as their pastoral caregiver. Let's go through this. Was it a premature death? Does the bereaved have young children or school-age children at home? Are they low socioeconomic class? Do they show high self-reproach? Do they lack close relationships? Is there a sudden drop in income? Is the loss trauma involved? Do they have a lack of communal support or personal support network? And adding to that, again, going back to the clinical depression symptoms. If you see any of these like pathological symptoms, that also can alert you and give you a sign that this person may need extra care. So this may be, let me find back to that. So yeah, this may be a good predictive approach so you can decide if there needs to be more proactive intervention compared to other usual cases. And if that's the case, then you will probably have to look into the possible professional counselors or physicians' resources for this person. Here's the case study that you may use to apply what you learned. Just to think about it, how to apply what we learned. I'm a widower, 78 years old, and live in a nursing home. I have been a Mennonite throughout my life. I come from a Swiss Anabaptist heritage. My partner of 40 years has just passed, leaving me alone. I feel sad and lost and are having difficulty eating and sleeping. I'm also angry that my partner died before me, leaving me alone. I feel some guilt about this anger and have asked to see a pastoral caregiver. So in this case, what you will do is assess the story by using grief models. Like, what kind of models are you going to use? Do you prefer? Or is it a combination of a few models? After that, you need to investigate the current coping process of the care seeker and how to help the person to restore oneself. What's the best way to go about it? And then also look to see if there are any signs of high risk, like psychological and clinical risks. Is there any suicidal risks? Are there any signs of pathological depression? All these things should be considered as you go, as you encounter this grief case. So investigate these things will be really helpful for you to actually see the big picture and come up with a big plan. That's it. This week's lecture has covered a wide range of grief models and care skills. Next week and the following week, we will look into domestic and sexual violence. Since next week is a short week because of the Holy Week and spring recess, hopefully you're so excited about it. You look forward to it, I bet. And you only read one chapter next week because it's a short week. And then most of the readings will be covered in week 12. And the second reflection paper is coming up. So you may want to start reading the week 12's reading. There's no forum discussion or reply next week, week 11. And I will finish uploading the reading list by the end of this week for the week 11 and 12 so that you can go ahead and start reading those things and think about like how you go about the reflection paper as well. If the subject of domestic and sexual violence is emotionally too traumatic for you or may trigger some intense emotions in you, please feel free to reach out to me by emailing me so I can discuss the better way to deal with the situation for you. Also, please know that the book review due date is April 9th, which is right after the spring recess. So start working on the book if you haven't done it yet. All right. Have a let me stop sharing here. So have a productive and peaceful week, and hopefully you can enjoy the spring recess. Okay, God bless. Bye.